What happens when the sun, moon, and earth align perfectly? It partially depends on where you are, but if you're in the right place at the right time, you get to experience a total solar eclipse. It's an event known as totality. Last Wednesday brought a total solar eclipse for parts of Russia, Greenland, Iceland, and northern Spain. In many other places, the eclipse could be observed technically, but it was only partial, and you'd have to know the partial eclipse was coming to even notice. Isn't that often how it is when God is doing something big outside our line of sight? Today, there are several epicenters of revival happening in places we cannot observe directly, like Iran or much of the global south. But that does not mean the Lord will not bring a spiritual awakening to North America. It's happened before, so let's join our hearts together and pray, Lord, do it again. Welcome to Haven Today. I'm David Wollen, sharing the great story that's all about Jesus. Today we begin a new series. We're calling it Born Again, the message of the Great Awakening. We're going to be telling one of the most important true stories of history for evangelical Christians today. It's a story that many of us know far too little about. And this week, we'll tell the story by focusing on the message of the person who was on both sides of the Atlantic, the key figure that God used to light the fires of revival. We'll be telling the story of George Whitefield, and in the process, we'll be catching the wider story of what God was doing across the Atlantic. This is one of my favorite topics, not just because it's such a great story, and it is, but it's because it translates so well into the here and now. God has not brought revival only one time in history, but again and again and again, across the centuries, across cultures, across denominations, and across the whole world. And my goal by the end of this series, my hope and prayer is that each listener, hearing what God has done in history, the history of the Western world in which we still live, that this will kindle a desire in our hearts for God to do it again, to bring a new season of repentance and revival across our world. And one of the best ways that we can do that, looking back and remembering what God has done, is to take a look at the story. What was it like in those early days as George Whitefield began to preach?
Whitefield is well known for his field preaching, outdoor preaching, and sometimes it is because people are hostile to him and won't let him preach in their churches. But from the beginning, most commonly, it's just because he's attracting these huge crowds in a time when a big church would seat maybe 500 people. And so he's attracting thousands of people. And then it's not too long, especially when he goes to London, that he's attracting crowds that are reported, 10,000, 20,000, 40,000. Yeah.
That's Dr. Thomas Kidd. He's a leading expert. He's a trained historian who is also an evangelical Christian, and his expertise is in this period of history, and he'll be joining us to help tell the true story of what God did during the Great Awakening. And alongside this, I'm also excited to share something with you to help bring this true story to life.
Benjamin Franklin, your brother said he could use your help at his print shop. You have my blessing.
Gonna do good things, Pa. Great things.
From the oceans through the valley.
George Whitefield, you will be an extraordinary preacher.
Remember the source of your power.
You don't believe the stories from London are true?
I am doubting Whitfield's claim that he can be heard and understood by so many. Without evidence, I won't believe it.
Let us proclaim freedom to the captives! Whom the sun sets free is free indeed!
Have you ever heard a voice like that? The blast from heaven.
Benjamin Franklin.
Reverend Whitefield, partnering with me would guarantee the maximum benefit to your cause.
A match made in heaven.
Or just a deal made in a print shop.
General George Washington.
Today, we stand in an even darker valley.
The survival of this country must be our chief concern.
This Constitution cannot fail.
We cannot let the sun set on this nation.
You are lighting a powder keg, my friend.
When you follow him, you are led by love. Why can't I get through to you?
I choose evidence over faith. Stop trying to change me.
You have promoted the greatest awakening these colonies have ever seen. You are the lightning bolt, George. I am just the lightning rod. And who is the source, Ben?
Let them receive your gift of salvation.
One tiny candle illuminates 1,000.
Arise, O sleeper! Awaken!
Yep, I got pretty excited when I heard this film was being made by none other than Sight and Sound. They are famous for what they do on the stage in theatrical productions, but this is truly a movie, not a play caught on film. And it does tell the true story of George Whitefield. And that's with a nuance, because the story is told through the vantage point of another famous man in history, Benjamin Franklin, who was Whitefield's friend. But he remained unconverted and unmoved by the gospel. The combination of Whitefield's clear articulation of biblical truth, how so many responded, and yet seeing how one person's heart could remain cold is convicting, moving, and powerful. This is an amazing film. I'd love to send it to you. It's called A Great Awakening, and we have it here on DVD. It's our way of saying thank you for your support of Haven today. Your gift is what keeps us on the airwaves. So would you make a gift today and help us proclaim the message of the gospel? You can make a gift at 865-HAVEN, 865-HAVEN, or go online to haventoday.org, haventoday.org. This is Haven Today. I'm David Wollen, and with me today is an expert on the subject that we're giving our focus to this week. With me is Dr. Thomas Kidd. He is research professor of church history at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. And Dr. Kidd, welcome to Haven Today.
Thanks for having me.
So this is fascinating to me. I was just reading your bio a few minutes ago, and I knew, because I've read some of your books, that you're an expert in church history, especially the period of the Great Awakening and early American history. But I didn't know that you got your PhD under George Marsden, who also has written some pretty significant biographies. In fact, I've read his biography on Jonathan Edwards, and you have written extensively about people from that same era. So just give us a little background in terms of where your expertise is and what fascinates you about this period.
I did work with Professor Marsden, and that was an amazing experience to be able to go to Notre Dame. And I was actually his main research assistant for the Jonathan Edwards biography. So that was just amazing. I mean, that was so influential for me. And I started working on the Puritans, and then my second book project was really where I got into the Great Awakening itself. I did an overview of the Great Awakening, especially in America. And then in 2014, I did a biography of George Whitefield, who's the most influential evangelist of the First Great Awakening.
And that period is where we're going to give our focus. And for anybody that is unfamiliar, soon they'll get acquainted with this. But I think the backdrop is helpful because, if we remember studying this period maybe in history, we were thinking about the spiritual fervor that seemed to sweep through the colonies. And it wasn't just the colonies; it was happening in England and abroad. So the Lord was doing something even across the Atlantic Ocean. But if we just think about it that way, we're sort of missing the backdrop, because that's hardly what it was like before the fires of revival begin to spread, right? So I think that's actually maybe a helpful place to start. Can you describe the world, both of England, where George Whitefield was born and grew up, but also the colonies before the awakening began?
Yeah, I think that, Whitefield is a Church of England minister, and so the Church of England is the official national church in England. But because of its state affiliation, it tends to be, somewhat corrupt, and the pastors are on the state payroll, and there's just a lot of problems with it, and it needs to be revived for sure. And in the colonies at the time, especially the southern colonies, are officially affiliated with the Church of England. And then in New England, it's a little more interesting situation because the New England colonies had been founded by the Puritans, Massachusetts and Connecticut and so forth. But they were founded in the 1630s. And so you fast forward 100 years to the outbreak of the Great Awakening in the 1730s. And there definitely had been spiritual decline in the New England colonies. Whitefield is entering a situation where it's not like they're just pagans or something like that. I mean, these are people who know the Bible. I mean, you have this kind of weird situation where you have a lot of unconverted people, but they had grown up in church and they knew their Bible really well, but they weren't born again. I mean, that's sort of the center of Whitefield's audience is churched but unconverted people.
Okay. So that's the backdrop, and we are painting with pretty broad brushes here. Now let's rewind the clock and let's dig into this story of this particular man, and it's interesting the way that his story develops. His relationships sort of touch on the who's who, really, of the entire Great Awakening. But where did Whitefield begin? What kind of a family and situation was he born into?
Yeah, he's in kind of a nominal Anglican Church of England family in England, and difficult family situation. His father died, his mother got remarried, but it became clear in his teens that he had a phenomenal talent for public speaking and for acting. It was just a talent that God gave him, but he wasn't converted. And so the theater at that time had kind of a sketchy reputation. It wasn't a reputable kind of career, but, you also had, the Shakespearean tradition of great theater and everything. So he ended up being able to go to Oxford University as a servitor or a servant. And so he would basically do chores for the richer students, but it was a way for him to be able to go. And I think even then he thought he might become a pastor. But like I said before, I mean, the Church of England, to be a vicar or a priest in the Church of England was a social status kind of thing as much as any kind of spiritual commitment. So certainly there was no assumption that people would be converted or, spirit-filled to be a minister. And so for him, it was kind of, well, I know I'm really good at public speaking, so maybe I'll be a minister. But the Lord had other plans for him, and he ends up getting converted at Oxford University.
So it's kind of like an upward social path for him to escape the world that he'd known and maybe climb the social ladder a bit. And at this point, it's just fascinating to me. I love when we can see this in people's stories, how the Lord doesn't waste your background. He's doing something that you don't know about. And Whitefield, even in a place like the theaters of the 1700s, body as they were, yet he was learning this skill that God was going to harness and do something incredible with. I think that's worthy of note. But at university, at Oxford, some relationships begin there. He begins to meet people, and the Lord begins to turn his heart and his life.
Yeah, he famously gets affiliated with what's called the Holy Club. That's kind of a term of derision towards these people because the non-evangelical students thought they were weird and too serious about God and everything. But it included John Wesley and Charles Wesley, who are better known as founders of the Methodist Church. It's interesting the timing because the Wesleys were not converted at that time either.
Exactly. But isn't that fascinating?
Yeah, but they were all kind of realizing at the same time that their Anglican faith tended towards moralism and lots of sort of spiritual rigor, but they knew that there was something missing at the center, that they didn't actually know the Lord.
Yes.
They thought, well, I'm just going to keep trying harder and harder and somehow, win the Lord's approval or something. So it was a very works-oriented kind of thing. However, the Wesleys and the other, Holy Club or Methodist, club members, they knew enough to introduce Whitefield to some really great spiritual classics, and among other things, taught Whitefield that the most important thing was to be born again. Even though the Wesleys are sort of mentoring him, Whitefield actually ends up getting converted earlier than the Wesleys do, and that is through all this devotional reading that he does in the Puritans and all this. And so Whitefield at Oxford ends up having this really long, drawn-out, dramatic, but in many ways difficult and even troubling kind of conversion experience where he's fasting for months on end and he develops health problems and
his health declines, right?
Yeah, but then he finally realizes he just can't add anything. I mean, he can't bring anything to the table, and he sort of flings himself on his bed, and he just surrenders his life to the Lord. And so he's converted, and then the Wesleys are going to be converted a couple of years later, most famously when John goes to the Aldersgate meeting in London and says, "My heart was strangely warmed." The Lord is moving in these guys' lives, kind of simultaneously. They're trying to figure things out. None of them have kind of all the answers, but the Lord draws them ultimately to faith, all within a few years of each other.
So I know some of the Wesleys' story. They head off to do missionary work in the southern colonies of the U.S. Unconverted, I believe, at that point. So they have some difficulties, even more so than they expected. But in the meantime, Whitefield, he's finishing up his studies, and at some point he begins to enter into preaching, and there's something a little different about him, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a convergence of he has this God-given natural talent that you saw even before he was converted, and then the conversion and the anointing of the Holy Spirit, I mean, just turn him into this, phenomenon of a preacher that the Church of England had hardly ever seen before. And so he begins preaching in the mid-1730s, and just naturally, I mean, people are coming from all over to hear him preach, and it's pretty quick that he begins attracting crowds that are bigger than the church where he's preaching. I mean, it's beyond standing room. And so Whitefield is well known for his field preaching, outdoor preaching, and sometimes it is because people are hostile to him and won't let him preach in their churches. But from the beginning, most commonly, it's just because he's attracting these huge crowds in a time when you're, a big church would seat maybe 500 people. And so he's attracting thousands of people. And then it's not too long, especially when he goes to London, that he's attracting crowds that are reported, 10,000, 20,000, 40,000. In one case in London, there's a report at Hyde Park, there's a reported crowd of 80,000 people. And of course, there's no amplification.
Let's just put this in context, right? So we just finished not too long ago watching the World Cup. packed stadiums of maybe up to 80,000 or less than. Imagine the power goes out in one of those stadiums. That's how many people are there. There's one guy on a stage who speaks at the top of his voice. It sounds impossible, to us that anybody could have heard him, let alone all of them hear him. And that seems to be some of the fascination, certainly later with Benjamin Franklin, that God had gifted him with just this phenomenal, unusual, dare I say, maybe freakish voice that could just be heard for so far.
Yeah, I mean, he had to have just been phenomenally loud. I mean, there's just no way around that. But he also trained in the theater and knew how to project his voice for dramatic effect. And so he knew those techniques as well. And I think if there were 80,000 people there, they could not all hear him. I mean, you don't want to, oversell this, but there's no doubt that he's assembling crowds, non-military settings that are larger than probably any crowds ever in human history. I mean, so that's part of the drama of this is like, nobody's ever seen settings like this before.
Yes, Whitefield was drawing them in a sense because he was kind of a phenomenon, but the Lord was drawing people. I mean, there was a stirring going on and a fire was being lit, and people had no idea how far that blaze was going to go. But we'll pick it up tomorrow. And so, Dr. Kidd, thanks so much for being with us and sharing from this true story of how God has worked in history.
Thank you, David.
This is Haven Today. I'm David Wollen. Dr. Thomas Kidd will be back again with us tomorrow, and we'll begin to get into the moment when Whitefield's ministry takes off. That happened first in England and then in the colonies as the Lord brings revival into a moment in history when it seemed as though the church was dying. But the Lord began to awaken people, and the church was renewed. This is the work the Lord does over and over in history, and I'd love for you to be inspired with this true story through the film A Great Awakening. We have it on DVD here at Haven. It's our way of saying thank you for your gift of ministry support. You can give by phone at 865-HAVEN, 865-HAVEN, or online, haventoday.org, haventoday.org. I'm David Wollen. Won't you come back again next time? We'll be keeping it all about Jesus. It's the great story here on Haven Today.